Thank you again for joining us. Today's session is called Bringing Your Whole Self to Work, Unpacking, Covering, and Intersectionality in the Workplace. This session is part of our Practitioners for Change virtual learning series that is powered by Capital One. And the idea of this series is really to, well, bring us together as practitioners across three different verticals. We have our DEI dialogues, which are really intended to sort of network and ideate and kind of share challenges and best practices with each other. So we're really kind of taking a step back and ceding the mic to all of you in those programs. We also have the Practitioner Wellbeing series that many of you are already familiar with. That is led by our dear friend, Xander Keg. And then of course, this pillar, which is the intersectional learning, is really intended to focus on the topic of intersectionality, sort of demystify it a little bit, and really to help us understand what intersectionality really is and how it can make an impact in our workplace. So we are going to have hopefully what is a very engaging and fun session for you every Wednesday. We kicked it off last week with our colleagues exploring non-binary identity and best practices. And my colleague Rebecca will share a little bit more about the exciting program that we have for you next week. But again, today we're really demystifying this whole idea of intersectionality. And I want to recognize that many, if not all of you on the line are practitioners, are folks who are leading these conversations or who are in charge of bringing in folks to lead these conversations, such as, for example, Rebecca and myself here. And so I want us to go through this content in two ways, if we can. If you've never participated in this activity before, and even if you have a bunch of times, I want you to really be earnest in jumping in and thinking about your identity, especially as a DEI practitioner. We're always, and if you're focused on certain communities, right, certain verticals, you're always going to be sort of focused on what you can do for the groups that you are working with. I want you to take a minute and sort of put your oxygen mask on first, if you will, and we're really going to think about how you individually show up in the workplace. Of course, as practitioners, I want us to add a second layer to this, and it is to consider how facilitating these conversations can actually help foster belonging in the workplace, help demystify these concepts. Rebecca and I are putting the final touches together on what will hopefully be a useful resource to you, which is really outlining the activity that we're going to be going through together, as well as making this recording available to you so that you can also facilitate these conversations in your teams, in your ERGs, and really, again, to just kind of unpack how people show up and really, again, demystify this idea of bringing your whole self to work, because we say that a lot. What does that really mean? Okay, so let's jump into it. By now, hopefully you are familiar with Mentimeter, which we quite enjoy using. So you have two options here. This is going to be our interactive software just to kind of kick up the Zoom webinar experience a little bit. So you can either hover your camera, your smartphone over the QR code, or you can open a new tab in your browser, wherever that may be, and type in www.menti.com and enter the code you see on the screen, 28071893. And while we do that, I'm just going to take a quick moment, make sure everyone in the chat is doing well. Hello. Excuse me. Okay, and you'll have a chance to continue joining as I move through the session. So no worries if you have just joined or if you're a second late to the activity. But before I change the screen, so again, giving folks a chance to get in there, tap that heart if you're in. Again, menti.com and enter that code. If you just use the QR code, it took you directly in there. You don't even need to type anything in. All right, so What we're going to do next is an activity that is probably really familiar to you before. We've called it a couple of different things, identity walk, identity signs. And today I'm going to call it what it really is, which is unpacking how we show up at work. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a series of statements on the screen, and I want you to click on, it's going to be a multiple choice, right? I want you to click on the answer, the phrase that best corresponds to your answer. So again, a series of statements, one at a time. Once I change the slide, the Menti code will pop up one more time. But as you read these statements, I want you to think about, particularly in the workplace, how you respond, right? How are you going to fill in the blank for these statements? Again, try not to overthink it, which I know for some of us is impossible. However you're defining the terms works, and I encourage you to use the chat to share some of your thoughts, although note that we'll also have an opportunity on the Mentimeter to put everything up on the screen, which I think is a little bit easier than the chat. Everybody's ready? Again, the code is going to show up at the top of the screen if you're missing it. And here we go. So the first question is, at work, the part of my identity that I'm most aware of on a daily basis is what? Is it sexual orientation? Is it perhaps your gender identity or expression? So your race or ethnicity, or your socioeconomic background, your language, disability, other health factors, your religious affiliation, other categories that we're not capturing here because it's impossible to capture everything. And I encourage those of you who are clicking other not listed, of course, if you're comfortable doing so, sharing what those might be. And again, we want to kind of click on everything, right? This is one advantage, and you'll see this when we talk about facilitating this. You can facilitate this session in two ways. Pre-COVID, I think we were really only doing it in person, and we've called it identity signs because it is literally signs that you put around the room, sort of force everybody to walk to, right, and congregate under these signs. Virtually, we're doing it as we're doing it here, and each version has a pro and a con. I think what both of them sort of force people to grapple with in different ways is precisely this idea that I just saw floating in the chat of like, I like them all, right? I kind of want to answer every question here. So I want us to take a moment and pause just of the folks who are on the chat, of the folks who are on the webinar, again, many of whom are DEI practitioners ourselves, the parts of our identity that we're most aware of on a daily basis very much seem to be gender identity and or expression, right? So just an interesting moment to sort of flag and see what it is that shows up for us. And I'm opening up to see some comments. Education level, right, is sort of one of the other not listed categories. Perhaps neurodiversity, which might be categorized as disability by some, but not others. So neurodiversity is another category, and other. Age, right? Excellent. So folks are really aware of our gender identity and expression, and to a somewhat lesser degree, really our race and ethnicity, right? So ask, how does that show up in our daily conversations and interactions, but really, how does that show up in our DEI work and in our focus? Okay, next question. Again, don't overthink it. Just jump right into what you see here. Part of my identity at work that maybe I'm least thinking about, right? Least aware of on a daily basis. And if I may call out a point I'm seeing in the chat, I think is really great here. At work, I feel like my neurodivergence is a disability, but outside, it's just a part of me. So it's really interesting to think about the relationships, right, that our identities have to the way that we interact in different spaces, at home, in the workplace, et cetera. So again, a really good point. And this is why in this context, we're really exploring how this shows up for us in the workplace. Interestingly enough, Majority of folks are saying religious affiliation, maybe, right, is something that's not top of mind for me. It's part of my identity that I'm least aware of, maybe followed by language. And I have to say, having facilitated this activity across the country and across a number of years now, this seems to be a pretty constant response, particularly here in the US where we're based, which is really, again, leading us to think about what are the things that we think about, the most. I think gender, race are categories that are certainly top of mind. But by extension, by not maybe being aware of language differences, by maybe not being attuned to religious affiliations or different religious accommodations, what lens might we be missing in our DEI practice, for example? So that's one of the questions to ask ourselves here. And just want to take a minute here. Excellent. Okay. Next statement. Part of my identity that provides me with the most privilege, again, we're looking in the workplace particularly, is blank. So we're going to unpack these terms again in a minute. But however you are determining privilege, is how we're answering this question. Part of my identity that provides me the most privilege. Okay, so race and ethnicity seems to be one of the major groups here for folks. And again, if you've just joined or if you missed participating earlier, you can jump in at any time with the code that you see at the top of the screen, menti.com, and the code 2807-1893. Excellent. Okay, so part of my identity that provides me with the most privilege, race and ethnicity, really followed by socioeconomic status, right? So interesting thing again to consider, just taking personal stock. What does that mean for me in my personal interactions with my colleagues and my teammates? And what does that mean in terms of my DEI practice, right? And sort of where I turn my attention and my resources to. Am I really paying attention to the spaces where I have privilege, and am I leveraging that privilege in a useful way? Am I maybe uncomfortable with talking about those things precisely because I may have that privilege and therefore I'm not really engaging with it as much? So again, we're really just kind of meditating on this and unpacking it. I'm trying to do that and read the comments. So a little bit of difficult to do both, actually. So I do want to acknowledge some of the responses that are coming in, for example, on other, again, a category that provides me with privilege in the workplace, educational qualifications, right? Allowing me to assert a certain level of privilege. I present as straight and I'm able to mask my neurodivergence. These are two really good examples, right, of things that by the way that we are visually read or by the way that we are interpreted by others, that we may actually be able to experience some degree of privilege, however small that may be. Right? Being a man provides me with privilege, but again, recognizing perhaps race plays a bigger role. And again, that depends, right, in which contexts we're interacting in. Seeing again some of these comments, job level and expertise, education, right? Absolutely, these are really interesting categories of privilege. So again, just want to take a moment and have folks just glance at the screen, sort of take visual stock of what's going on. And as we're doing so, again, at the beginning, I said I want to talk about this in two levels, us going through this content, but also talking about what it means to facilitate these conversations. The truth is, they can unpack some pretty interesting truths for folks. And I've noticed, you have to be to embark in this sort of activity and have it be a meaningful exercise for your colleagues and your teammates, I think does require a degree of courage on the part of the organization that is organizing this conversation, in as much as there's courage to be open to feedback and open to recognizing where we might need to pay more attention, pay less attention, provide more resources, etc. And what I mean by that is that the responses that people have to these activities can really unpack some interesting blind spots for folks, some interesting opportunities for areas of further investment, again, in time or resources, but it does require that openness of, if you are asking folks, your colleagues, right, to share of themselves, either physically in the room by walking around and kind of engaging in this exercise, or anonymously, as we're doing today through the virtual activity, we're still asking people to be open, to be vulnerable, right? And to share a little bit about themselves. And so in doing so, what is a commitment that we're making back to them? In our case here at Out and Equal, our commitment is we're going to share how to do this, right? And hopefully, and continue refining it and bringing that back to all of you. But as I mentioned, what is the ask, right? What are we doing with this information if you're facilitating this conversation internally? Is it going to lead to changes in your ERG programming? Is it going to lead to changes in onboarding structures, right? I don't know what that might be, but these are things that you need to be open to considering if engaging in these activities. Otherwise, folks feel like they've just shared these parts of themselves and then sort of don't have an avenue or a response in which to do so. So again, a very courageous activity in that way, but also, and this is one of the privileges of doing it virtually, as I mentioned, through something like Mentimeter, though you can really use whatever you'd like, is that there is that further anonymity that allows people, I think, to be a little bit more raw and honest than they might be, if they're in the same room as their boss or their boss's boss, for example, right? If you're doing this activity in a conference room. Okay, next question. Part of my identity that I feel is most difficult to discuss with others who identify differently. Most difficult. With folks who identify differently. Okay, just want to give folks a chance here. And this is always very illuminating. Again, it's really a roadmap, I think, in some ways, to where our conversations might go. And difficult, I recognize, as someone is saying in the chat, it's a relative word, right? Part of my identity that feels most challenging, less natural, right? But something that doesn't maybe flow quite as much. So I'm seeing pretty evenly split, honestly, amongst sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, religion, followed by disability. I'm seeing some responses coming in the chat around that other. I see a couple of people noting relationship status, right? And being poly-identified as one of those other categories. So relationship status is a really, really great example. I very much hear one of our colleagues saying, explaining the nuances, right, of my racial identity in this case, for this person of being Afro-Latina, right? What does that mean for them to explain the nuances of Black heritage and culture within the Latino community? That's an excellent example. I'm seeing mental health as well as and some of these pieces here, being aware of my disability, understanding how it affects me, but for others being understanding about it, right? Being non-binary, gender identity and expression is something that can be a bit difficult to discuss with others. I'm seeing caregiver identity. I'm seeing neurodivergence again. So again, this is an activity that really gets us to start unpacking some things. And the follow-up questions for ourselves are really, what does this mean, right? What does this look like? As someone mentioned in the chat, difficult is a relative term. So what exactly do we mean by that? And what implications does it have for our DEI efforts, for our belonging efforts? That socioeconomic status is something folks still struggle to talk about. That sexual orientation and gender identity are still things that are difficult to discuss sort of with others, right? That religious affiliation is another one of these categories. How can we open up spaces for folks to chat and interact with these? Okay, so I have one more question to sort of wrap up this activity a bit here. And this is, again, just an opportunity. I've seen folks chatting in through the Zoom, so no need to retype that unless you'd like, but just to give folks another opportunity of what are some of the things that came up for you during this activity. So I'm seeing some insight, hopefully into your own identity and how we show up. Nuance, importance, thank you, right? Importance of acting on the data that we're gathering. And this is a big thing, whether it's something like this or whether it's something on a larger scale, like a self-identification effort, right? To what end and what commitment are we making to folks when we're asking them to share themselves in that way? Recognizing the number of elements to our identity, the privileges that we might experience, right? That I may have a bit more privilege despite being a gay Hispanic male. I'm seeing intersectionality, how much privilege being a cisgender white male can provide for me. It can be hard for me. It can be hard to differentiate these things for me because I view my sexual orientation and gender identity as completely linked, right? Though others might not. And this is one of the key components of this activity. It's weird. It's unnatural to do this kind of unraveling of our identity, right? I don't wake up in the morning and say, today is Wednesday. Today is my 75% Colombiana day. I'm going to be 75% Colombian. Did I feel like 20% like a woman and maybe only like 5% queer? But on Thursdays, I'm like 50% queer. That's not a thing, right? You are always yourself 24/7. So I really appreciate that recognition for folks of like, this is weird and unnatural to be able to kind of pick one of these things. And I'll also say for folks who've done this activity a few times that your responses may shift depending on where you are physically in terms of who you were with in that space, where you are in terms of your career versus where you did that activity before. So again, it really is an unnatural activity. I recognize that. And when one of the things that you lose virtually, but that is visible in person when you do this activity with physical signs around the room, and then you kind of congregate everybody in the center, read the question and tell them to go to the sign that fits them. It's always interesting to see that couple of folks who are standing in the middle, who are really hesitating or who are trying to kind of grab two spaces. It's not possible, right? So this activity sort of forces us to unravel that intersectionality in order to be able to bring it back up together again. Okay, let me see any other examples. All right, and again, my phone keeps going to sleep when I go to change the slides, so that is frustrating. Okay, so now to bring this sort of to the next phase here, we've done this activity, so what? Again, I think some of this content is already very familiar to you, so I'm really going to be talking to you as fellow practitioners and facilitators of these conversations, and really, hopefully we can talk about why bring up these concepts and how these concepts can be useful to us in making intersectionality real to people and in unpacking this kind of nebulous, like bring your authentic self, bring your whole self to work, right? In terms of making that tangible for people, in my opinion and Out and Equal's opinion, this activity followed by a conversation on covering and intersectionality have served to now I don't want to sound like a Hannibal or anything, but have softened people up, right? And what I mean by that is to build that empathy to kind of get folks to shed what might be perhaps sometimes a defensive stance or a shameful stance, right? In terms of having conversations around privilege and marginalization and diversity and inclusion efforts in the workplace. And some people are really, a little uncomfortable with that. And the reality is those people exist and we need those folks on board, right, in order to foster these cultures of belonging. So I say this at the outset to say that for those of us who are the very first person to sign up for, the webinar on intersectionality, for those of us who are the first person who's leading, education efforts internally in our organizations to unpack some of these efforts, we're not centered in these conversations. And that's by design. As much as I would love to, come in and sort of talk to other me's in this space, I certainly want to encourage and engage folks who are already invested, but I also see the challenge and the real need to bring on board those folks who might be hesitant, because the reality is they exist in the workplace. They are in positions of authority in the workplace. And it only serves everyone, for all of us to feel like we belong and to foster these cultures together. So having said that, covering is this concept that, again, I think many folks in the DEI space are well familiar with at this point, but is one that I think really helps people kind of click why allyship is necessary. Take a sip from my comically large bottle here. Apologies. So again, just to recap, this idea of covering has been around in sociology for quite some time, but specific to our workplace DEI conversations, I think really took hold in 2013, I believe, when Kenji Yoshino, who's an NYU law professor, and who'd written a book on covering in the context of American law, worked with Christy Smith at the time at Deloitte Research University, at Deloitte University, the Leadership Center there, to really look at what covering is today and sort of what impact does it have in the workplace. And how they're defining covering is how individuals, and shout out to Deloitte, of course, to those of you who are from Deloitte on the chat. And I'll say shout out for not having this research under a paywall. I send everybody, just type in the search and you will find the PDF right on the Deloitte website. So shout out indeed. Okay, so this really interesting research, what they did is they took this sociological concept, sort of took some of the conversation that Yoshino was looking at in the legal framework and said, what does this mean in the workplace in terms of people's day-to-day experiences? They surveyed a few thousand folks to find out, how they downplay their identity in the workplace. And so again, how folks with a known stigmatized identity, a marginalized identity, downplay that identity, make a great effort to keep the stigma of that identity from looming large. Now, there are some cousins, as I like to say, to covering. I saw folks in the chat earlier, especially when we were talking about neurodiversity, refer to the idea of masking, right? Masking, I think, is a cousin, but it is not the same thing as covering. The same thing with passing. Passing is not the same thing as covering, but they all kind of share some familial relationship, right? Again, specifically with covering, what we're talking about is downplaying, not negating, but just downplaying a particular type of difference. So I want to take a minute here. And again, I love how chatty this group is. In a webinar, because webinars don't really allow us to interact much. So I'm seeing a lot of folks go through the chat. Continue to do so. Like I said, I can see them, Rebecca and Q can see them, but I also have this Mentimeter text box open for those of you who would prefer that. And I want you to share, perhaps not now, which is excellent news, but perhaps at some point in your career, you've downplayed some sort of aspect of your identity. So what has that looked like? I see someone saying, for example, presenting as conventionally masked, right? So that is very much one, as masculine, that is very much one way of doing so, altering your appearance, right? The way that you express your gender to kind of fit more in a box of what people might expect of you. I don't speak up as much, not correcting pronouns. Again, I'm seeing a lot of presenting, right, in a cisgender or more feminized way. Tattoo coverage, again, so seeing another one. Being guarded about sharing about my son when people know that he is trans and knew him before the transition. Not pointing out every time someone misgenders me, right? Using we or us pronouns instead of referring to my partner as him, right? That's a great example, kind of just downplaying the difference, using a different name socially than I do at work. I don't talk about my neurodivergence. I don't acknowledge my sexual identity. I cover my symptoms, right? I downplay my anxiety. Not cutting my hair short for years, very much one example. I don't cover. I love that, right? Vague about my spouse's gender, guarded conversations about my personal life. Utilized my credit cards and loans to fit in with activities that require money at work when I don't have any. Very much so. I allowed people to assume I'm straight in the past, right? I mask and I pass rather than I cover. Not really forthright about my sexuality. I don't talk about my medical marijuana card. I need to go to an appointment instead of sharing that I'm my brother's caregiver. Sort of pass as a straight woman instead of pansexual. I don't really talk about myself, really share as many personal stories in the workplace, right? So again, thank you everybody for sharing those. These are all very common ways in which we cover aspects of our identity in the workplace. Unsurprisingly, given who we are and who's on the line and sort of our focus, a lot of these are related to gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, right? Familial makeup, related to our LGBTQ identity, but covering goes across all aspects of identity. And I see some of those examples in here as well. So having said that, why do we talk about covering, why do we talk about this research, right? When doing this activity, when talking about intersectionality in the first place? And there's a couple of different reasons for it. One, I really like this concept of covering, and I think it makes really clear for people why these things happen. And but by which I mean like why folks are kind of having these experiences of feeling more uncomfortable, of the pressure to maybe downplay aspects of their identity. And I think by some of the data that came out of the Deloitte Yoshino research, specifically out of some of that data, I think really helps people again, soften up and sort of build empathy and engage with belonging efforts and DEI efforts in a way that perhaps they may have been a little bit more resistant to in the past. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that at its most basic level is that the majority of people who were surveyed across industries, across identities, cover in the workplace, at least along one axis. So this idea of covering can be further broken down, and I saw many of these examples come in through the chat, along 4 different ways, right? You might alter your self-presentation, dress in a more binary way, dress in a more feminine or masculine way than you would want. You might straighten or dye your hair, right? You might cover your tattoos. All of these are examples of covering something around your appearance, your self-presentation, again, to blend into the mainstream. Affiliation-based, how you might avoid behaviors associated with your identity, often to negate stereotypes. And I saw some of that come in, maybe not as explicitly, around some of the mental health comments that were coming in, right? I don't share these aspects of myself. I medicate these parts of myself and don't talk about them. I don't ask for the time off because of this thing. I'll kind of say it's this other more generic thing. So again, avoiding these behaviors, right? Whatever they might be that are associated with that identity. Advocacy based, how much you stick up for these affiliated groups. How much, how often am I going to be the angry feminist that corrects people when they make some sexist joke? I'm going to have to make a choice and let it go, right? Even when the affiliated group is you. I saw that in some of the chats as well. At some point, I just, stop correcting people when they're misgendering me, right? So again, it's a choice. It's not that you are not out about your identity, but you recognize that constant bringing of attention to it, in this case, by correcting people who are misgendering you, may have different repercussions for you. And so you, in that split second, right, kind of make the calculation and say, not worth it. My sanity, my energy, my relationship with this person, whatever that might be. And over time, those things pile up and they have a really big impact on us. How can I feel like I belong in a workplace where people don't even see me as I am, for example? Okay, pause for chats. I want to make sure. Yes, very much so. Advocacy and coming out, right, to stick up for affiliated groups, and to build off of that point in the chat of the need for allies and sort of vocally sticking up for affiliated groups, because when you are the member of that marginalized community, day over day, minute over minute, hour over hour, it can be exhausting, psychologically, mentally, physically, what have you, right, to always be calling that out in people. So this is where allies jump in the very tangible example that we're talking about here of misgendering somebody, right? To use the example from the chat before, rather than just kind of look on and wait for the misgendered person to one more time call attention to this and be the one to ask for the correction, as an ally, I can jump in and say, hey, BTW, they use these pronouns, right? So very much so, to build off of that idea of allyship, advocacy, because of these choices that we make, advocacy is so, so important from our allies. But again, to kind of wrap this part up here, the final axis of covering is association-based. Ultimately, you just stop avoiding, you just stop engaging with other folks in that affiliated identity. You just avoid contact with them. I'd love to join the Latinx ERG, the LGBTQ business resource group, but you know what? I've seen, some of the comments that people made last time when I put, the rainbow flag on my desk, or when I was speaking Spanish on the phone, I saw somebody roll their eyes, and I don't want to deal with it. So I'll be on the mailing list, but I can't attend any of those sessions, right? You start kind of alienating. Again, you're not negating those identities, you're downplaying them, right? And it leads to isolation. It can have real impacts, negative impacts on folks, which we could talk about further, but we have 20 minutes and I want to make sure that I get through some of the rest of this content. So again, as I said, the reason why we bring this up in the interest of talking about intersectionality and the need for intersectional allyship in the workplace, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about bringing your whole self to work, is the idea that everybody covers. As I said, 61% across the board of the respondents report covering in the workplace. That includes 83% of the folks who cover their sexual orientation, because this survey did not look at gender identity in a complete way, meaning they only looked at sort of cis male and female experiences. 79% of Black and African American respondents also reported covering in the workplace. Perhaps most interestingly, 45% of straight white male respondents also reported covering some aspect of their identity. Again, there's no one group in the workplace that is immune from covering, that is immune from feeling that pressure to downplay some aspect of their identity. Now, I'm going to talk about these concepts of privilege and marginalization in a minute. This does not mean, and I want to be very clear about this, and I try to be very clear about this when we have these conversations. This does not mean that everybody's experience of the workplace, everybody's pressure to cover, and the way in which they cover and the pressure to do that covering is the same thing. Absolutely not. There are very different and disparate experiences that people have. But the fact that every single demographic group surveyed, including straight white men, experience some form of downplaying an aspect of themselves in the workplace opens up a couple of avenues for us, right? It opens up the avenue of engaging and saying, everybody needs belonging in the workplace. This is not about inclusion or diversity by bringing in one particular group. This is about, we've got diversity of identities and thoughts. We've fostered these practices to build inclusion. Now we need to think about equity, and we need to foster that belonging. So how can we think about allyship, right, as this open, engaged way of interacting with each other in the workplace, for example? So that can be one of the ways. And again, I've seen this, I've seen it have this effect of perhaps there's that one person in the room who's maybe a little bit like, oh, this is yet another one of these sessions that are going to tell me about how, I have all the privileges, but it doesn't recognize, right? They never talk about the fact that I grew up on welfare, or the fact that I'm a religious minority in this town that I'm in, right? So again, it sort of forces us to look at identity not in a vacuum, to look at it amongst its intersections, but to also kind of open up that space to build empathy for each other, because by doing so, this is how we can kind of make that commitment of folks becoming allies. One more water break. And as I now transition to the last part of this, which is bringing this all together to talk about intersectionality. We've unpacked, we've unraveled the identity parts through this activity that we did, and by forcing ourselves to choose one answer. We've talked about that impact, why and how you might feel less comfortable bringing these parts of yourself to work and how that shows up for you through this idea of covering. Now let's talk about intersectionality. What does that mean? And be honest, if you're like, I don't actually know what it means, you can say that, right? So this is one of these buzzword terms that we talk about quite a lot in this DEI space. What does it mean for you? Okay, whew. Let's see here. Humans are complicated. I'm not sure, honestly. Being marginalized based on more than one identity. Place where various dimensions of identity intersect. We are more than one thing at a time. Commonalities within differences. Some of our marginalized parts that make me unique. Right? Yeah, and I think we're all being more than one of the boxes. I think we're all approaching this precisely through the same way. In the interest of time, I am going to skip through some of the details of the background of intersectionality for two reasons. One, because it does take some time, and two, because I really do encourage you, and Rebecca or Q, perhaps if one of you can find this link and share it in the chat, but Kimberly Crenshaw, who is credited with sort of being the lead person who's really built out this framework and this theory of intersectionality, had a TED Talk called The Urgency of Intersectionality, which I highly recommend. It's about maybe 15 or 20 minutes altogether, I think. But the part that I'm talking about is about 4 minutes in, and for about 5 minutes, she gives an overview, which I'm now going to summarize wildly, about sort of how she came to think about this framework. And again, the very oversimplified framework for this idea was looking again in the legal framework of the United States, and specifically looking at workplace discrimination, when this woman by the name of Emma DeGraff and Reed brought forth a case alleging that she was discriminated against due to being a Black woman in the United States, meaning due to her racial and ethnic identity, as well as due to her gender identity as well as a woman. The court sort of rejected this outright and said, we can't really hear this case as is, right? You can allege discrimination due to race, that is illegal, and we will hear that case. And you can allege discrimination due to gender, and that is illegal, and we'll hear that case. But there's no such thing as both of them at once. So needless to say, that wasn't quite capturing Emma's dilemma, as Kimberly Crenshaw puts it, because this particular workplace did happen to have Black employees. They just all happened to be men in sort of the factory industrial setting. And it did have women employees. They just all happened to be white women sort of working in the administrative front offices. So all of this to say that lack of a legal framework is really, and Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar, is really what drew her to kind of start to build out this theory that has since jumped from law to women and gender studies, to DEI efforts, in the workplace. And it's a framework that it really does have its background in Black feminist thinking and critique of the singular category of womanhood, right? Particularly in the United States, though not exclusively so. Okay, so all this to say, what is intersectionality? We've talked about how she came to think about it, but what does it really mean? I think a lot of folks were right on that previous slide. It is about an intersection. It is about the crossing of different identities, but it is not the ranking of identities, right? And it is not the listing of identities. What it is And I was going to click it on Zoom before I forgot it's on my phone. 1 second here. What intersectionality actually is, to quote Kimberly Crenshaw in her own words, is it's a tool. It's an analytic sensibility. It's a framework for us to think about identity and its relationship to power. So if you take one thing away from this webinar, please have it be this. Intersectionality is a framework, right? It's a way for us to think about identity and its relationship to power. To continue Crenshaw's statement here, originally articulated on behalf of Black women, the term brings to light the invisibility of many constituents within groups that claim them as members, but often fail to represent them. So intersectional erasures are not exclusive to Black women, though of course that is again where that theory originates. So intersectionality as a framework, not as a, again, as I said, as a ranking or as a listing, but as a way of us thinking about identity and its relationship to power. So what does that mean? I'll use myself as an example. As a first generation, Latina, cisgender queer woman in the United States, right? I can just list all of my identities and you can list all of your identities. And I could be like, these 3 of my identities are marginalized and these 2 are privileged. What do you have? That's not how this works, right? It's not a poker game and it's not cards. What it means is my identity has different relationships to power. I have different access to different privileges, or by extension, I'm marginalized from that privilege and that power in different circumstances. And I have to analyze how that works because it's not constant. In our very specific circumstance of DEI initiatives in the workplace, what we're really looking at is how do these different aspects of my identity show up at work, right? Which aspects of my identity are valued, welcomed, celebrated, really told that they belong in the workplace? Which parts of my identity maybe aren't quite feeling that yet? Where do I have power and how can I leverage that power to help those who don't have that power, right? So that's what we mean by intersectionality. It's a framework, not a listing. So if intersectionality is a way of thinking about identity and its relationship to power, what is power? So we could spend like a whole decade really looking at cultural studies and looking at the concept of power. But again, to simplify it and to bring it to our discussion today, we're really talking about power as, and to use Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words here, the ability to achieve a purpose. At its most basic, power is the ability to get something done, right? To achieve a purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. To kind of flesh that out a little bit more, at its core, power is about the ability to achieve the outcomes that we want. But as I said earlier, power is relational and situational. We may have power in one context, we may be powerless in another. Power is unevenly distributed in our society. So as allies, we have to recognize our power in order to effectively harness it. So what does that mean? Power is relational and situational. We may have power in one context, we may be powerless in another. It's not the same thing, right? Your identity and your relationship to that identity shifts in different ways. As a first generation Latina in the United States, my identity, my US born Latina identity certainly has a particular relationship to power, not great, within the context of the United States, right? Those aspects of my identity are maybe more marginalized or maybe more pushed to the side. Interestingly enough, when I've traveled with my family to their country of origin, right, that same identity that has marginalized me before, all of a sudden opens different doors for me. Because now I'm coming in as a US citizen, I'm coming in as a native English speaker. And yes, some other doors close because they make fun of my accent and that, I don't want to eat certain things. But in terms of power and my ability to have access to certain things, I have access to certain benefits, certain materials, right, that others might not. And totally, it's a double-edged sword as we look at, as you mentioned in the chat here. But I raised this one very specific example first to make this real, because I think, when we talk about it, it can be kind of esoteric, but also because if Intersectionality is about looking at identity and power. And if power is about that, ability to achieve purpose, and it's relational and situational, we all have some degree of power. That does not mean that we all have the same degree of power, nor that we can all affect change in the same way. That's just realistically not the case. In a workplace context, we have different access to different resources, different seniorities, et cetera, et cetera. But what it does mean is that we need to be mindful of not talking about identity in a vacuum. This part of my identity is completely privileged. This part of my identity is completely marginalized. Doesn't fully work that way. And by having that framework that is always looking at how does it relate to power, and however, power is defined in that context, that's what it means to apply an intersectional framework. Okay, so I'm aware that we have about 8 minutes left. We're not too bad on time, actually. So just to wrap up these concepts here, so we talked about intersectionality, framework for looking at identity and power. We've looked at power at its most basic level. It's, to get something done, right? To achieve a goal. And power is relational and situational. It's not an all or nothing situation. So that brings us to privilege. So how do we define privilege? We've talked about this a couple of different ways at Out and Equal, and I think where we've landed, though certainly open to conversation on any of this, is defining privilege as a collection of unearned and of earned advantages. They can be visible, they can be invisible, based on a person's social identity or group membership. Like power, privilege is relational and situational. So while we all have some degree of privilege, corresponding advantages a person receives are based on where they are and who they're with. So again, all of this is building towards us having a more critical framework of identity, that when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and equity efforts in the workplace, we're looking at identity and power, not just kind of, identity in a vacuum, because then we're just listing things. How do we define, sort of context? But really building for folks, especially in our corporate workplace context. Yes, everybody does have some degree of privilege. There's very much privilege to be able to take an hour and be in a job where you can take an hour to participate in a webinar like this, right? So recognizing privilege, and I know we're getting on time, so I won't go too far down this rabbit hole, that we could if we had more time. There's no use in feeling shame about our privileges. Work that out with your therapist, right? But in the context of workplace equity efforts, that shame does not allow us to mobilize. And I realize that my shoulders are disappearing. So hopefully that's not been too distracting. Shame as a system is really not allowing us to be useful. You're just going to sit in that shame. You feeling shame about your gender identity or your racial identity or, our cisgender identity, like that's not helping anybody. So what do we do? The idea here is, how are we leveraging our privileges to support folks who experience marginalization? Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. I think this is, of our concepts, probably the one that's clearest here. But what I do want to draw attention to is the impact of marginalization, right? Where people are pushed to the margins, consciously or unconsciously, it doesn't matter, the impact is the same. If you're pushed to the margins long enough, you start to internalize those feelings, right? That whole imposter syndrome thing, that's not you, right? That's external. That's that process of marginalization. So an intersectional framework will also help us unpack that. So to bring this whole conversation together, again, this is a framework. Take what works for you and what doesn't, right? But this framework of this opening activity, followed by facilitating some conversation on covering, and therefore unpacking these key concepts of intersectionality, power, of privilege, of marginalization, all of that brings us to allyship. Really, when we're talking about bringing your whole self to work and fostering inclusion and cultures of belonging, what we're really talking about is how can we be better allies to each other in the workplace? So how we define ally is someone who leverages their privileges to actively support, respect, and advocate for members of marginalized groups. We can all be allies. Yes, I am a member of the LGBTQ community, so I need straight allies to leverage their privilege. But I'm a cisgender woman within the LGBTQ community, and I experience privilege compared to my trans and non-binary friends and family, right? So how can I leverage my privileges and allyship of them? So again, thinking about our allyship not as that sum of either or, but of how we can kind of engage with everyone. And let's see here. So I'm not going to play it, obviously, but I am going to give you this video. You're going to have the link. We're going to make sure you have this deck and like the Amber Hikes video, but then also this video of I guess me talking right now. But I do want to pause on this to emphasize, and I'm seeing the hearts coming in from those of you who were with us in 2018 for this workplace summit in Philadelphia. Amber Hikes, who at the time was working for the city of Philadelphia's Office of LGBTQ Affairs for the mayor, and now is working at the ACLU, gave a really powerful keynote on intersectionality and shared some key takeaways here. I'm going to encourage you to watch that full video. It's like 6 or 7 minutes at most. It's incredibly powerful. But if there is a takeaway of this, there's a slide you're screenshotting. This is it. This is Amber's takeaways. 3 key ways that we can start being allies. And I have 3 minutes, so I'm watching the clock. 3 clear ways that we can be allies moving forward, and keeping that intersectional framework in mind. The first is interrogate your surroundings. Again, intersectionality, identity, and its relationship to power. In the workplace context, literally, who is at the table? Who has the power to make decisions? Who are the senior leaders? You might not be able to change the senior leadership, right? But you have a seat at that table, and your colleagues, your LGBTQ colleagues might not. How do you bring their perspective and voices in? How do you build a pipeline for them to sit at the table with you? There's no women at that table, and you're one of the men. How are you advocating for bringing women in? How are you bringing in their perspectives, right? Signal boosting, right? And the example that she gives is from the Obama administration, when some of the female staffers were getting talked over by the male staffers. And so they decided to sort of, actually, as Rebecca was saying, I really like this really good point that they were making. Amber, I really want to pull out with what Amber was saying over here. You know, Isabel, to pull off of what Isabel was saying by XYZ. And so that idea of signal boosting credited the original author, kept that idea on the table, right? Let that person know they have an ally in the room. Our example earlier of misgendering, right? Being able to say, hey, actually, their pronouns are they, them. Her pronouns are she, her. His pronouns are he, him. Whatever that practice might be, signal boosting, right? And letting that person know that they have an ally in the room. And finally, calling in and not calling out. And I'm gonna pause there and not give too much detail, because I do want you to hear how Amber talks about this. But again, this idea of bringing folks in a way that they can hear us. And that's really what we're trying to do with this whole session, with this whole conversation. Again, as I said, it's not for those of us who are going to be the first one to sign up for the DEI efforts. We're going to have the most inquiries. It's really intended to approach people in a way that gets them to understand the value of allyship, the win-win that is fostering that culture of belonging for all of us. So with that said, I realize that there are maybe 30 seconds, maybe less on the clock. It just changed for me. So I am going to leave this slide open. Should there be any questions, then we can follow up with you when we send the follow-up email. So I'll just leave this open. Should anybody wish to chat in any comments or put them in the Mentimeter. But again, I want to thank you all so much for joining. I have seen a lot of comments come in, although unfortunately, I think I've missed a couple. Please, please join us next week for a very powerful conversation featuring Michelle Miao and Michelle Mi-Jung Kim, continuing our framework on intersectionality and allyship, really digging a bit more deeply into some of the workplace tools that we can use to use this. So again, thank you, thank you. Please leave us your feedback on the survey. I will keep this line open should there be any questions folks want to chat in. Otherwise, thank you all very much.